Great. Okay. Yes, it is. There we go. All right. So welcome to everyone. This is our first meeting back in our Wednesdays at noon for September. So we are off to an amazing start. We have Martha Paynter, who is a PhD nursing candidate here in our School of Nursing, and Clare Heggie, who is a Masters of Arts student. And they're going to be doing their presentation together, is what I understand, title being Mother-Child Connection and Provincial Incarceration. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Martha and Clare. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll let you to do a little bit more of an introduction and let people know who you are.
Perfect.
Do you want me to share my screen? I have the slides open.
Sure, yeah.
Whatever works.
But even before the slides,
yes.
So I'll just introduce, Claire and I have been working together for several years, and this project emerged out of, it's a community-based research project that is a partnership between a community organization that we belong to and several other government and community partners in the province. So Claire and I are with Wellness Within, an organization for health and justice, and Wellness Within has since 2014 had security clearance to provide doula support at the Central Nova Scotia Correctional Facility in Burnside, Dartmouth, commonly known as the Burnside Jail. And this doula support is, at the time, there wasn't a ton of evidence for it, but since 2014, there have been several studies across North America looking at the value of doula support in prisons. And through the work as doulas, we also began doing twice monthly women's health and reproductive health and parenting workshops with people incarcerated in the East Unit. So the East Unit is designated for women. There are also trans and non-binary people in that unit designated for women. And in doing these workshops, really, we had very regular contact inside, and that was how we came to learn more broadly about the concerns for mothers and parents on the East Unit.
Sorry.
And then in 2019, there was a consultation. So the way Burnside works is, if you are to have a visit, this is all pre-COVID, keep in mind, if you are to have a visit, if you're an incarcerated mother and you want to have a visit with your child, it's like in the movies where there's a phone and glass. So you can't touch the baby, you can't, there's no contact. And just to contrast that with, for instance, the situation at Nova Federal Institution, where we also have security clearance to provide doula support. So that's in Truro. And not only can you visit in person, you can apply to have some time at the family visiting house, so you can stay overnight. And actually, they have a mother-child program. So eligible mothers and babies can stay living at the prison in the minimum house until the child is almost 5. So the Burnside situation is pretty bleak. People who are incarcerated at Burnside, I'm finding that the screen is changing constantly. Is that normal?
Sorry. It's not on my end. I'll just leave it off until we start, so it's not going around.
Okay, all right, let's do it. Yeah, so Burnside people are incarcerated for either remand, which is most common, and up to 80% of people at Burnside are remanded, and that's when you're held pre-trial. So you haven't been tried, you haven't been convicted, you haven't been sentenced, you are 100% innocent, and you are behind bars. And then the other reason you could be incarcerated at Burnside would be because you had a sentence for less than 2 years. More than 2 years, you go to Nova. So in that context, the average length of stay at Burnside is a week. And a week is enough time to lose custody of your children, lose your housing, lose your job, lose your income assistance. It's a really dramatic impact on your life for just a week of likely remand. Anyway, so in this context, in 2019, there was a consultation organized by the Department of Corrections, the Division of Corrections within the Department of Justice provincially. And they held the consultation at Millbrook. And it was to talk about how to improve things for mothers and their children at Burnside. And we noticed, we were invited, we were grateful to be invited, but we noticed that a lot of people were missing from the table. Most importantly, the mothers. The mothers had not been included in this consultation process. So we suggested that they be included, and Corrections came back to us and said, okay, fine, you lead that. And so we did. So this research study is a qualitative study by for and with people who experience incarceration, looking at what happens to their relationships, to that mother-child connection as a result of provincial incarceration. It really was Clare who led a lot of the data collection and analysis and coordinated the team behind this work. So I will turn it over to Clare to walk us through the research. And we're just putting the finishing touches on a manuscript about this work. So that should be submitted maybe this week.
Yeah, maybe today.
But if anybody has any questions about wellness within or the process before we get started, and Claire and I are both very casual, please feel free to interrupt us or put questions in the chat, and I'll monitor that at the same time as Claire's talking and I can respond. All right, so I turn it over to Claire. So Claire, well, she can explain this to you, but she is a grad of the master's program here at DAL and has a research expertise in feminist analysis and reproductive health issues. Okay, I'm gonna mute myself.
Okay, thanks, Martha. So we'll go skip this because we kind of gave the introduction. So like Martha said, it was a collaborative project. So myself and Martha, other members of Wellness Within, Lauren and Claire. We also had support from Coverdale Courtwork Society. So they provide frontline services to women, trans, and non-binary people who are criminalized or incarcerated. So we had a lot of support from them recruiting the mothers who participated in our study. And we also had a research assistant, Domenica, who had lived experience being a mother who was criminalized. So she helped us with the analysis and contributed to the final results. And the project was funded by the Mi'kmaq Family Healing Center. So we'll start with, well, land acknowledgement, genocide acknowledgement. So I don't know where everyone is because we're on Zoom, I guess, but we're in Mi'kma'ki, where 4% of the provincial population identify as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And this is very relevant to our work. 15% of provincially incarcerated women are Indigenous compared to that 4% provincial population. Over 42% of federally incarcerated women are Indigenous, and the incarceration of Indigenous women rose 60% in the past 10 years. So some background, which Martha covered a little bit of, but the fastest growing population in prisons right now is women in Canada. Most incarcerated women are mothers, although there's not a lot of statistics or data collected on this. And in Nova Scotia, as Martha said, the Central Nova Scotia Correctional Facility is where women are incarcerated provincially, also known as Burnside. More than 60% are held on remand. And as Martha said, the average length of stay is 1 week. The province does not collect any data on the number of children or any other reproductive health data. There's no mother-child program. and the in-person visits are always behind glass, and phone calls are extremely expensive, which we'll get into a bit more as we go through the results. Oops. So there's a few acts and regulations that sort of stipulate treatment of persons incarcerated. So the Nova Scotia Corrections Act, which would cover corrections in Nova Scotia. It mentions child only once, and it's not in relation to the particular needs of a child. Mother, if you do like a search through the act, mother is not mentioned at all. I think parent is mentioned a few times, but it's not in the context of the needs of the parent or the child. There's also global sort of standards that stipulate minimum treatment of incarcerated parents. So the UN Bangkok rules, rule number 2 reads that prior to or on admission, women with caretaking responsibilities for children shall be permitted to make arrangements for those children, including the possibility of a reasonable suspension of detention, taking into account the best interests of the child. There's also the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which covers, kind of similar to the Rule 2, the best interests of the child. So it stipulates that decisions by any sort of legal or governing body should always be made with the best interests of the child in mind. There's limited Canadian research on maternal incarceration. Most of the research we found was from the United States, so it's a bit of a different context there. They have the highest incarceration rates in the world, so there's prisons and incarceration that are on a scale that we don't have, well, not in Nova Scotia and not in Canada. And there's international research as well, which all shows, unsurprisingly, that maternal incarceration has detrimental effects on both the mother and the children. There was a recent study, sorry, I'm looking at notes on my other computer to remember exactly what it was, that the experience of any family member being incarcerated leads to a 2.6 year reduction in life expectancy, controlling for other variables compared to the general population. That's pretty striking, I guess, or like a stark statistic. So I don't want to repeat what Martha went over. So the Department of Justice held the consultation that Wellness Within attended, and noticed that there was a lack of voices of lived experience of mothers who had experienced incarceration. So that's where this study evolved from. And the main aim was to explore the experience of provincially incarcerated mothers in Nova Scotia, and then to offer recommendations to the Department of Justice with respect to improving those experiences. So the study design theoretically was rooted in feminist standpoint theory, community-based research, and prison abolition. So feminist standpoint theory just recognizes that knowledge is subject to situatedness and centers the research on the experience of women, particularly the experience of women experiencing intersecting experiences of oppression and identities. And prison abolition critiques the inevitability of prisons in our society. So all of the organizations involved in this, including Wellness Within, identify as prison abolitionists. So we look to alternatives to incarceration rather than reform throughout this study, and frame the results with that. So to participate, people had to identify as a mother and have been provincially incarcerated in the last 5 years. All of our eligible participants were recruited through community organizations, through Coverdale mainly. So we conducted one focus group before COVID, and then after COVID, 14 individual interviews. So all of the individual interviews took place over phone. We also offered Zoom, but phone was an easier option for most people. And 3 participants were incarcerated at the time of their interview. So we analyzed all the data collaboratively with the collaborative team using thematic analysis. And membership of the team included community workers and people with lived experience of maternal incarceration. So that supported some of the validity of the emerging themes. And we developed 4 key themes that I'll go through in detail. So the first 3 are about the time spent while incarcerated, and then the last theme is about the time upon release and after. So the first 3 themes are maintaining connection, broken bonds, and accessing support. And then following release, the damage done. So the first theme, maintaining connection, is really about just maintaining the minimum amount of connection that they could to their children while they're incarcerated. So the first sort of sub-theme was the visits, so the in-person visits with the glass. So the visitation was really the most challenging strategy that participants used to maintain connection. There was a lot of participants expressed that they didn't want to have visits because it was just too traumatic to see their children with the glass between them. And also they felt like it was traumatic to sort of put their children through the experience of being in the jail setting. They thought it would be really traumatic for both them and their children, and so chose not to have visits, even though they expressed that not seeing their kids was extremely traumatic and distressing for them as well. For the mothers who did choose to have visits, they did describe the same, that seeing their children with the glass between them was really traumatic. It had really negative consequences on their mental health. They reported a kind of lack of privacy. There's no, you would have families on either side of you also having visits. They said it felt really unnatural and awkward, and especially with younger children. Mothers said it was difficult to explain the environment to their children. One mother said, she found herself lying, trying to explain the different aspects of the jail that her child was confused by, and then felt really bad about that afterwards. But it's just not a natural setting that's conducive to having a natural conversation. Mothers also felt that, so the visits were very traumatizing. On top of this, they felt that the visits were treated as optional or as a privilege by the jail staff. So one example was during COVID, all in-person visits were ceased, but people incarcerated were provided 1 free video call a week. But a couple of mothers reported that there was often like software issues or like tech connection issues. One mother said that if there was a connection issue during her scheduled visit, it wouldn't be rescheduled. So she would have to wait a week to make that call to her kids. And of course, her kids didn't know, why their mom wasn't calling at the kind of scheduled time that they had prepared for. So that had a negative effect on them and their relationship as well. This is a quote from someone in the focus group, said, "I think a lot of people look at it as a privilege to have access to your kids, and it is frowned upon. They don't want you to have privileges. But a visit is not a privilege, it's a right. They're not allowed to take away your visits. It's against your human rights, but they will do it." So building on that and what mothers' experiences of visits were, they felt that visits can't really be improved in the current system. So they described, this quote describes, "They could make a place where our kids could come and not know that we're in jail, like a little sitting area kind of thing with toys or whatever. Then that way they're not looking at me through a mirror, we're not between a glass. I would never ever bring my kids to jail because of that." So mothers would describe like the ideal setting for a visit, but all of the descriptions like this one it's just a setting that is no glass, not in a jail, somewhere where their kids wouldn't know they were in a jail, no guards, none of the sort of like carceral sign-in processes that their kids and caregivers had to go through. So there's really no way for Burnside as it is now to meet any of these requirements. So mothers found the idea of improving visitation pretty incompatible with their experiences of imprisonment. So simply put, the visits in prisons would be better if they weren't in the prison. There's also logistical challenges. So they'd need to have all their visitors pre-approved. They'd only be able to have 2 people on the list at any given time. So this was complicated for mothers who had, let's say, multiple children and like multiple caregiver arrangements. So 1 kid with this person and another kid with this person, or 2 kids with this person. And then that would complicate which kids they were able to see and which family members they were able to see. So in the absence of visits that were mothers felt comfortable engaging with, phone calls were really important. So everyone expressed how important phone calls were, extremely important for them to keep that like minimum level of connection. They also expressed how inaccessible they were. So they're very prohibitively expensive. It's also confusing and kind of bureaucratic to set them up. So the phone plans or bundles have to be set up online. So they have to be set up by someone else because the mothers don't have internet access. So there's just a lot of kind of red tape and steps that you have to go through, and or they expressed that they didn't have support working through those steps. So in the absence of support from the Burnside staff, they would reach out to community organizations such as Coverdale or Elizabeth Fry. But there were also like bureaucratic issues with that, where the first phone call they would have to pay for, and often they would call an organization, and these organizations, underfunded and understaffed themselves, someone might not pick up, and then just like a litany of all these steps just to set up something so small, I guess, but so essential. So as I said, they're really expensive, the phone calls. I don't know, Martha, if you know offhand what the cost is. But it was
about $20 for a call.
Yeah, so prohibitively, like extremely prohibitively expensive. So funding the calls was every mother, I think, mentioned this. It was a constant struggle. Mothers would share phone calls. So if there was a mother who had extra money on their phone, had family maybe supporting them from the outside, then they would share phone calls and give calls to mothers who wouldn't otherwise be able to speak to their children. So similarly to visits, on top of this, there's a lot of logistical issues. So if there was a lockdown, even if the lockdown was caused by an issue on the men's side, which it usually would be the cause of the lockdown, the women wouldn't be able to leave their cells and wouldn't be able to make phone calls. Mothers expressed that this caused a lot of stress and anxiety. Also, if a mother is placed in medical segregation, they are unable to make phone calls. So if someone was isolating due to COVID symptoms, for example. Lack of privacy was an issue again. Mothers had an issue with not having phone numbers memorized at the time of incarceration. So just like all of us, like all of my numbers are in my phone. I don't have any, I probably don't even know my partner's number off by heart. So when you have that taken away, it's very difficult to logistically set up who you need to call and get those numbers approved. And then the same thing with the visits, having to rotate between children who were in like varied custody arrangements. So both logistically and also financially, if you can only afford X number of calls a week, one call a week, and you have 2 kids in 2 separate places, then you're kind of forced to rotate through them, for lack of a better word, which mothers described was they felt guilty about it, and it was stressful for their children as well. So yeah, in general, mothers, they're really important, the phone calls, and they felt that the staff maybe didn't fully understand how important they were. So this quote kind of sums that up from the focus group. I asked if I could use the phone, and she, referring to a staff member, said, "Well, why would you want to do that?" I said, "Well, it's Mother's Day coming up and my son always sends me flowers." She said, "Oh, I'll just bring you the flowers I get." And that was the end of the conversation. "We don't want your guys' secondhand flowers. And the flowers weren't the point. The point was to come and talk to him on a phone. So the second theme that emerged was broken bonds. So the separation from their children caused a lot of stress, extreme emotional duress. Mothers described feeling really depressed, really anxious, stress from the separation, but also stress just thinking about how they're going to work to rebuild that connection or that bond, or work towards regaining custody of their children once they're released. And some others said that they just felt so discouraged thinking about the barriers to maintain a connection while incarcerated that they just kind of gave up. So the visits and the phone calls, it just was extremely stressful, extremely discouraging, and had a really negative impact on their mental health. So as this mother said, I actually went 11 months without being able to see my daughter, like touch her. It's definitely really overwhelming. It brings a lot on you, and it's hard. So participants also described how the broken bonds and the separation affected their children. And they described different ways that their children were coping or not coping with the separation. So some children felt or feared that their mother was never going to return. Some mothers explained that their children had stopped talking to them or become estranged from them in order to cope with the trauma of the separation. So this quote, this participant said, her daughter kind of killed me off in her mind in a way, just to grieve, so it doesn't hurt her so much, because it really bothers her and hurts her that her mother's not around and I can't be there for her, just for simple things, sharing test scores and baseball games and, parent-teacher things, just the basics. So that was really hard for this participant, just knowing that her children weren't in contact with her, just because the separation was having such a negative impact on them. It was just easier for them to sort of cut it out. Others reported that their children felt anger and resentment towards them. There was one mother who said she had sons and she was worried that this would kind of translate into a cycle of domestic violence or abuse because they were holding this anger and resentment towards her for not being there. And participants felt that it was really unfair that as it's kind of described, that the burden of their incarceration was being borne by their children. So most participants identified as single parents or lone parents. They felt that they had few options for the custody of their children when incarcerated. So in the absence of a second parent who's involved and safe, children were either put into foster care or into the care of a family member if that was an option. So participants with young children in particular are really worried about the effect of missing those critical years for like attachment and child development. And they just felt it was really unfair, like the level of trauma and negative impacts on everyone like in the family for, as Martha said, even just a week or a month just seemed really unfair. So this participant described her situation and said, if the courts could be more attentive to people having kids and try to I don't know how to word this, do things other than incarcerate mothers. I'm in jail now for something that my ex-boyfriend is accused of, and I'm accused of being there with him. So that's why I don't have my son, which is kind of messed up if you ask me, because he, meaning her ex-boyfriend, is out and he's not stepping up for my son. I think that if the courts would look at my situation more and realize that I'm a young mother and I was an abused woman, there should be something different than going to jail. My son barely knows who I am now because of being incarcerated. So just describing a situation that she felt and we would agree is really unfair, and that her sentencing and her situation didn't really take into consideration her situation as a mother. So participants were required to access services to demonstrate rehabilitation and to work towards regaining custody or having contact with their children when they were released. So things like recovery support, mental health, parenting classes, but being incarcerated made it very challenging to access any of these services. So there was a general lack of services described at Burnside. This quote says, "No one knew anything or fully did any of their jobs, and that's just what happens at the provincial jail." It took me over 4 months to even see the social worker at the jail. And then basically at that point, it's like, do you need help with anything? No, I've got everything basically figured out at this point. I just wanted to see my kid. That could have helped me in jail and with CPS, Child Protection Services. At this point, I could have had a plan put in place with the right help or whatever, but because of being in jail, I was given a lot of non-answers with a lot of shit. So just knowing that participants knew that they knew that they had to access this support, and they wanted to as well. Most participants expressed really wanting to access mental health supports, different things that they wanted to do to work towards parenting, but there was just a total void of services, or if there were services, like in this situation, it would take so long to see them that by the time you could access them, you had kind of moved past it and tried to make do on your own. So in the lack of services, or in this void, participants really relied really heavily on community organizations. There was a lot of positive comments from the participants about how community organizations had helped them, but these organizations are usually limited in staff, very tenuously funded. So while they were stepping in and filling that void, it's not meeting the need fully. Worse than a lack of services was the outright denial of services. So some mothers reported being denied essential services, like as stipulated by the Bangkok rules, which I talked about, as punishment, or having services withdrawn or withheld from them for what they felt was punishment. So this mother describes, they refused to take me to family court, and there were a couple times with family court I was supposed to be there, or my lawyer put the request through so that I could actually be there, and I wanted to. And CN, the jail, the guards or whatever would say there's some error, or, oh no, there's no pickup order. Well, I know there was a pickup order made, so that kind of impacted me. So situations where community organizations or lawyers are doing everything they can to make the appropriate arrangements and put in the appropriate requests, but it's being denied or withheld. And then in this situation, not showing up at family court would have a hugely negative impact on this mother's chances of connecting or having contact with her children. Participants also described that or perceived that their efforts to reunite with their children were sometimes sabotaged or impacted by jail staff. So one mother recounted that the trauma of being in prison caused her to express suicidal ideation and thoughts of self-harm, that was reported to Child Protective Services. And she felt that that was unfair, given that it was a response to the jail environment. So this theme is once people are released from prison, what that experience was like. So mothers described being released with basically nothing, no clothes, not a functioning cell phone, no access, no connection to housing. One person said that they were lucky if they got a bus ticket. That would be like the bare minimum that they might get. The release did not come with any programs, didn't come with any resources. So a lot of people felt that it was kind of inevitable that they would end up re-incarcerated, because they were leaving Burnside with not knowing where they would stay, how they would set up housing, no way to contact their children or contact Child Protective Services because they didn't have a cell phone. So many, many, many barriers. As this person describes, they don't give you the right avenues towards organizations or a counselor, or your rights to being a parent and how you can get that back, or parenting courses or anything. They give you nothing. They don't set you up for any success when you get out of here. It's make do on your own. And that's why so many girls end up coming back, because they don't give you any type of step in a forward direction when it comes to anything. You know, like we need help in every aspect of becoming a parent again, and our connections with our kids and seeing them. So parents, all participants described a really deep desire to see their children or to work towards that and to follow through with what was being asked of them by CPS. But the resources to take those steps were not available to them because their basic necessities like phone, housing, were not being met. So it was difficult to get to the point where they could work towards those steps towards parenting that they really wanted to work towards. The greatest challenge, so there's like a list of their sort of basic needs that weren't being met, but above and beyond, housing was the most important issue that every mother spoke to. Not having any housing upon release or not having any connection to a way to start to get housing other than reaching out to these community organizations on their own. And in order to begin to work towards seeing their kids or regaining custody, they needed to secure a safe place for their children to even visit them, like let alone working towards their children staying with them, but even just to have visits. So participants described multiple barriers to housing, including having no money, not really knowing where to start, who to reach out to. There's a bit of a delay or a lag between applying to income assistance and starting to receive it. So that's another thing, that they're released without support getting already set up on income assistance. Some landlords won't rent to or wouldn't rent to them because of their criminal records. Some shelters wouldn't accept them if they're using substances. And aside from all that, as probably everyone knows, there's a huge housing crisis in Halifax right now. So shelters may be full. I know some participants said that mothers with their children take priority in some shelters, and they totally understood that, but felt that it puts them in a kind of unfair position as mothers who need to access housing in order to have their children with them. So they're kind of in a gray area where they felt that they weren't prioritized, but they didn't really know where else to go. There's really limited options when shelters are full and the community organizations are overworking, trying to meet a need. Oops. Okay. So some of our discussion points, I don't know if you want to jump in, Martha, or I can keep going, whatever.
Sure, I'll jump in. So as Claire was saying, if the idea for how to improve visits in the prison is to not have visits in the prison, that's sort of a dead end. And we also talk about how these kids, even though most of the people inside have kids, kids are totally invisible to the system. And there is a literature about that in Canada, the invisibility of children of incarcerated parents. There's no accounting for children in sentencing decisions. Analysis, a 2016 analysis showed that they just don't appear. Custody of a dog was more likely to appear than concerns about children in written sentencing decisions. The jail is ill-equipped to do anything quote unquote rehabilitative. It causes harm, and then the harm just stays there. There isn't that transitional support from a nursing lens. It's sort of like that discharge planning that needs to happen, and it's just not happening. Despite all of this, extraordinary resilience, solidarity, generosity, resourcefulness from these moms. A big limitation of our study is that we didn't require participants provide any demographic information. They volunteered some things. One of the participants identified as non-binary, a non-binary mother. They specified mother. There were some participants who identified as Mi'kmaq, some as African Nova Scotian, but we didn't ask that, and we certainly didn't ask anything about were you remanded, were you sentenced for something in particular. That was not the point of our project. And COVID was a challenge, but we overcame it. We got ethics approval to double the compensation. So we gave people a $25 phone card as well as a $25 gift card for participating, because it was going to have to be over the phone and use up their minutes. It was nice as a team to work on Google Docs together, and probably we got comfortable with that because of COVID, and we'll continue to do that even though we don't have to for some of our other related projects. Next slide. So where are we going from here? So we, unsurprising, are recommending that there needs to be investment in alternatives to incarceration when mothers are experiencing criminalization. This really should not be far-fetched. The incarceration of mothers, of anybody, should be the last resort. That's there in the criminal code. And instead, there is this default to incarcerate, a normalization of this response that actually is not supported by the law. And we need to deprogram ourselves, our police, our courts, our judiciary, from this reaction. It is much more cost efficient to support mothers and their kids in their communities than to spend $75,000 to $100,000 per person in the provincial system. There absolutely, until that day, while we are still experiencing this incarceration of mothers, we have to be collecting information about their children. The invisibility of these children serves to keep them from factoring into policy decisions. And so it's this round and round she goes vacuum of data that perpetuates this situation. So as per the Bangkok rules, as per frankly common sense, the name and contact information and other relevant data about the kids, their age, who's taking care of them, those kind of things, must be collected on intake. And then this stuff has to be regularly published. It has to be available publicly. We do have some data at Wellness Within about, for instance, that disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous women at the provincial level, disproportionate incarceration of African Nova Scotians, and that really should be much better publicized, as well as the connection between provincial incarceration and the child protection system. When you inquire with child protection services, most children are removed from the family because of an accusation of neglect. Well, yes, you are going to be neglectful of your children if you cannot be near them because you are incarcerated. So how these systems intersect and mutually reinforce each other really needs to be interrogated. And finally, visits and other contact with children, phone privileges, etc., should not be used as a tool for discipline. Wherever possible, the children can be removed from harm in these carceral policies and procedures must be followed as per the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and that best interest of the child principle. Next slide. Children and guardians should automatically on intake be added to a mother's visitor list and her bundle, her phone bundle, so that there isn't this rigmarole that can take weeks and weeks and weeks to get approved to call your kid. Lockdowns in the other units. So like most provincial facilities where designated for women, there is a co-located unit designated for men. And like in most places in Canada, this co-located unit designated for men is much bigger and it's much more violent. So you're much more likely to have a situation that would generate a lockdown from the unit designated for men, but it impacts the unit designated for women. And this just shouldn't be the case. They're two different units, they have two different staff. You should be able to keep things separate so that phone calls, visitation, programming, etc., is not canceled on the unit designated for women when there's an episode in the unit designated for men. Parents at Burnside should get a call a day for their kids. Calls to organizations like Coverdale and EFRI and government departments like the ombudsperson must be free. This is a public service that farms out to a private company, a private monopoly, the business of phone, and it's unethical. It's very harmful, and it doesn't make any sense that you should have to pay this private company to call, for example, another government department like income assistance. What mental health issues should never be weaponized about families. What happens in Burnside should never be weaponized as a reason to call CPS, for instance. Obviously, you're going to be distraught. Obviously, you're going to be strung out. You're in an incredibly stressful, harmful environment, and your behavior in that environment should not be reported back to CPS as if it's somehow endangering your child who you have no custody of at the moment. This should just never happen. And expressing mental health anguish should not be weaponized into a reason to put you in solitary confinement and deny you contact with your children. Release from Burnside must involve adequate transition planning, of course, and support basics. So, do you have a roof over your head if we are letting you go? Are you connected to income assistance? Do you have clothing? One of the things that is reported across the literature is the significant weight gain from very poor nutrition food at jail facilities, jail and prisons. So people often go in and very quickly are unable to fit into the clothes that they went in there with. They need appropriate and sufficient clothing on the way out. They also need a phone. If we're paying $100,000 to incarcerate them, we can find a $100 flip phone for them. Next steps. So we will continue to work with the Division of Corrections at DOJ to help them understand these impacts and what's happening for these women. We will continue to advocate for change. And part of our knowledge translation strategy is to communicate with the bar and the judiciary to continue to improve understanding of the importance of considering children in sentencing. So here in Nova Scotia, we are nationwide leaders in cultural assessments and GLADU assessments. So these are pre-sentencing assessments of the impact of the genocide against Indigenous peoples, of racism in Nova Scotia, generations of racism in Nova Scotia, and how these impact someone's life and should be considered in sentencing. We should also be considering children in these same types of pre-sentence reports. And next slide. So here are some contacts for us.
Only one email up there, sorry.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. And what else? Well, Claire and I have a conference. Wellness Within has a conference coming up on November 20th that everyone is welcome to join us. So it will be 2 days of this type of research from across the country. Yeah, more information on our website, wellnesswithin.org. So just note that we did change our name 1.5 years ago to just Wellness Within to be inclusive, gender inclusive. But for whatever reason, Gmail won't let us change our Gmail address. And the Registry of Joint Stocks has given us a bit of a hard time about changing our registered name, but we go by Wellness Within now. Okay, I will open it up to questions.
Hi, everybody. Rivers. Can you hear me, Martha?
No, I can't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're on mute, Carly. Keep trying.
Or you can type in.
Yeah.
I don't know. Worst comes to worst. How is this being picked up across Canada? Great study and very important. So we really just finished. We have presented this once before. We presented at an international conference about the children of incarcerated parents last week. So we're just kind of starting to try to work on dissemination. Yeah, it's, to our knowledge, the first study of its kind, and we certainly have a pretty aggressive strategy to spread it out there. Yeah, so I know, Carly, you're in BC, and we can talk about what similar things are happening out there. If they are not charged, does this affect their experience with CPS? Well, they're charged. So they are charged, and yes, it does. Once you're incarcerated, you're not there for your children, and you're vulnerable to CPS seizures of your kids. So it doesn't really matter. And you can be remanded indefinitely. People are remanded for 3 years. Because unlike a sentence, you're just waiting until your trial, and then things like COVID happen or whatever, and there'll be delay and delay and delay and delay. And like the healthcare system, wait times in the judicial system are huge. So you're very unlike a sentence. And actually, we don't get into this, but there is literature that shows that women are more likely to plead guilty so that they can have certainty and know, okay, I'm guilty, I'll have a criminal record, but I will be out of here in 17 months. So I can plan, because they like to plan and make arrangements for their children. And they will do that because they are thinking of the best interests of their children. And certainty to them is in their children's best interest. Okay.
I would also say, to your question, Carly, that the like cascading sort of impact, where if you're not sentenced and you're released, but then you've lost your housing and then you can't find housing, or you've lost your job and you can't, you've lost your source of income and you can't get back on it, that even kind of controlling for everything else, it would affect the experience with CPS, because it would impact all those like checklist of what you need in place.
Basically, neglect is a code word for poverty. So if you've lost your job, you've lost your house, you're neglectful, according to CPS. Tim asked, what do you see as the biggest barriers to decision makers acting on your recommendations? The biggest thing is just recognizing that abolition is not some radical idea. It's a very sound investment, but it is a major shift in our lazy reliance on the carceral impulse. So there is a retuning of the mind that has to happen. And you just look at what happened this past August with the violent police reaction to a community standing up for people without housing. And you see that our culture has become increasingly carceral and reactionary. And so that's the biggest challenge. How do you shift that and spark that creativity? There's a gorgeous center in Saskatoon called Sanctum 1.5. And it's a really great example to refer to. There's, I can't remember, about 10 beds, I think, and it's a house. It's a big house with a big kitchen and big living room and 24/7 nursing care. And if you are at risk of CPS involvement, you can go live there in your pregnancy and stay there for a couple months postpartum. And with a roof over your head and support and harm reduction philosophy, all of those women keep their babies. Every single one of them has their baby with either them or kin that they have chosen. So, and it doesn't cost as much as a horrible carceral system. So we just have to think creatively. Laura asked, thanks for sharing. Where did the interviews and focus group take place? How do you think this was impacted what was shared, talked about? As Claire mentioned, all of the interviews were by phone. 3 of them were in the facility. The women were still in the facility. And in general, all of the participants know that DOJ is going to hear about this research. They're not going to see the transcripts, but they're going to hear about the findings. And all of those women are at risk of being reincarcerated. All of them are at risk of being known to have been involved in this, and they all wanted to anyway, because they really think it's important. So maybe if they knew it wasn't coming back to anybody, they'd have said even more things, but this is what they said, knowing full well that the people who might be holding the keys will read it. Salma, what were the challenges you encountered to do a research with this vulnerable group? I mean, in terms of ethics application, do you face challenge accessing this group? So for us, because I have been engaged in this work since 2012 and have a very deep connection to these people, I can bring that into the ethics application and have demonstrated devotion to improving the well-being of women and moms who are experiencing incarceration. And I do think that that matters for the ethics application. We have incredibly long-standing partnerships with the organizations that were involved, Coverdale and EFRI. EFRI hosted the focus group that was in person. So it was women who were living in their halfway house that got together over tea in the living room and chatted. So having these really long-term, rich investments in each other as community-based organizations is critical to not just the ethics application, but the actual ethics of the project. Thank you, great question. I have a meeting with the prison in 3 minutes. Any last questions?
Just wanted to say thank you so much, Martha and Claire, for sharing your work. It's brilliant. It's so powerful. I've certainly learned a lot, and yeah, really look forward to seeing you implement and make these changes. I'm sure good things will come out of your research.
Thanks very much, Megan. Thank you to everybody. Do you consider hearing the experience of kids themselves? No, to be honest, no. It's too hard. And yeah, it's not, there are people who do that work, but it's not really where we're at yet. Thank you. Thank you. It was lovely to see some of you that I haven't seen in person, and I hope we do this in person soon.